It begins on a quiet street in Sacramento, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across manicured lawns. A convoy of unmarked vehicles rolls to a stop. Doors slam in rapid succession. The rhythmic thud of boots on concrete breaks the stillness. From the vantage of a body-worn camera, the frame jolts as an officer moves toward a modest single-story home, its beige siding dulled by decades of weather. A man in his 70s steps into view at the threshold. His posture is stiff, eyes narrowing in confusion as he notices the line of officers surrounding his property. The camera catches his hands, pale, veined, trembling slightly before steel cuffs snap shut around his wrists. Somewhere behind the camera, a voice calls out in clipped tones, "Code 4, suspect in custody." The air smells faintly of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke, but the mood is sharp, electric. Across the street, a woman in a floral blouse clutches her phone, murmuring to a neighbor, "He watered my plants last week." The words hang in the air, a disbelief that someone so ordinary could warrant such a show of force. Inside the suspect's garage, boxes line the shelves, each labeled in tidy block letters. An officer in latex gloves lifts a stack of yellowed envelopes. In the corner, another unzips a duffel bag, releasing the stale odor of long-stored fabric. None of them speak. Hundreds of miles away, in a climate-controlled forensic laboratory, the hum of refrigeration units fills the silence. A technician in a white coat leans over a terminal. On the monitor, digital bars align, highlighted in green. At the top of the screen, a single word flashes: match. The technician exhales, slow and deliberate, before sliding a printout across the counter to a supervising analyst. Beneath the crisp graph is an image, a faded black and white crime scene photograph dated 4 decades earlier. Across the top, in thick red ink, one word: unsolved. Back on the street, the suspect is guided toward the curb. His gait is measured, almost careful, as though aware that every movement is being recorded. The click of the cuffs echoes faintly against the muted hum of neighborhood traffic. Children's voices drift from a backyard 2 houses down, laughing, unaware that history is unfolding just steps away. An unmarked sedan idles nearby. As the rear door opens, the man glances toward a group of uniformed officers standing together, their eyes fixed on him. There is no shouting, no visible anger, only a stillness that feels heavier than confrontation. One officer adjusts the brim of his cap, jaw tight, watching as the man is placed inside the vehicle. From above, the scene would look unremarkable. A suburban street, a few curious faces behind curtains, a silver sedan pulling away. But within that movement lies the collapse of decades of uncertainty. The arrest is the result of an investigation that began before some of the officers here were even born. For years, his name never appeared in case files, his image never posted on any bulletin board. And yet, he had been there all along, moving through grocery aisles, filling his gas tank, waving at neighbors who never looked twice. The drive to the station is quiet. In the back seat, the suspect stares ahead, face impassive. The interior smells faintly of disinfectant and leather. The muffled sound of the road beneath them, a steady undertone. The officer in the passenger seat glances at a manila folder resting on his lap. Inside are photographs, maps, and transcripts, each linked by a single genetic signature. At the lab, a team gathers in a narrow conference room. On the wall, a projection cycles through locations, small pins marking suburban blocks, rural roads, and coastal towns. Each pin is tied to an incident: burglary, assault, homicide. The pattern is broad but deliberate, stretching across counties and years. The lead investigator stands at the front, the printout from earlier in his hand. He doesn't speak at first, letting the image of the suspect's DNA profile settle into the minds of everyone in the room. The technicians know the science. The detectives know the history, but none of them yet know how far this thread will unravel or how many lives it will reach back to touch. The evidence they hold is not just a match to one unsolved crime. It is the key to a series of them, incidents that haunted communities, split families, and outlasted careers. In the next hours, property records will be pulled, past employment traced, and timelines reconstructed. Old case boxes, long relegated to storage, will be reopened. Each will contain details that, until today, seemed like fragments without a frame. Now, with this arrest, the fragments begin to align. But as the sedan carrying the suspect turns into the station lot, a fact remains unspoken among those involved. The files do not represent a single chapter of violence. They chart something far broader, something that crept along the edges of California's suburbs for years, unseen and uninterrupted. And what they didn't know was that this arrest would uncover not one, but 3 decades of hidden horrors. The summer air in California that year was thick and unmoving, the kind that clung to skin and carried scents farther than they should travel. It was just after 9 p.m. in a quiet Sacramento suburb when the sound of crickets filled the space between houses. Porch lights glowed in pale halos, and the occasional dog barked at nothing in particular. Inside a small, single-story home at the end of a cul-de-sac, a young woman sat by her open window, a paperback balanced in her hands. The breeze brought in the faint sweetness of jasmine from a neighbor's yard, the scent mixing with the dry tang of warm dust. She had not noticed the shadow moving between the hedges, nor the slow, deliberate steps that made no sound against the grass. Somewhere down the street, a screen door creaked open, then closed. A moment later, the quiet fractured. Glass shattered. The sound was sharp, precise, not the clumsy break of an accident. A beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across her living room as if searching for a hidden shape. The intruder moved with purpose. No hesitation, no fumbling. He was inside in seconds, the smell of disturbed earth clinging to his clothes. In the dim light, his gloved hands worked quickly, pulling from a bag an assortment of objects: nylon cords, strips of fabric, a flashlight covered in tape to narrow its beam. The young woman barely had time to react before the cord was cinched tight around her wrists, the knot unfamiliar, not a simple loop, but an intricate tie designed to resist even the strongest struggle. Later, officers would note the prints left in the soil by the back steps: athletic shoes, men's size 9, a rare model not sold in local stores. The doorframe showed signs of being pried with a thin, flat tool, the kind used by locksmiths. Whoever had come here had done so before. The neighbors saw nothing. One man, walking his dog at 9:15 p.m., recalled a faint metallic click from somewhere behind the house but dismissed it as a gate latch in the wind. Another remembered the distant growl of a car engine, though no vehicle had been parked on the street when police arrived. The details didn't align, but they suggested movement, someone approaching, someone leaving under the cover of routine neighborhood noise. Inside the home, the scene told a different story. Furniture was slightly shifted, drawers half open, the telephone cord yanked from the wall. The smell of perspiration lingered, mixed with the faint odor of latex and something else harder to place, an antiseptic sharpness, as though the air had been wiped clean of fingerprints. The responding officers moved carefully, their flashlights catching on the jagged edges of broken glass. They documented the knots, the shoe prints, the marks on the door. They collected strands of hair from the carpet, not knowing that the technology to test them would not exist for decades. In those first moments, it was simply procedure: bag, label, move on. The young woman's absence was immediate and absolute. She had been there minutes before, and now she was gone. The timeline narrowed to the sound of glass breaking and the arrival of the first patrol car, a gap of less than 10 minutes. The precision of it unsettled even seasoned detectives. This wasn't the chaos of a burglary gone wrong. It was something practiced, something refined. By 10 p.m., the area was sealed off with a ring of cruisers. The low hum of police radios blended with the chirp of crickets and the occasional murmur from a small gathering of neighbors, their faces lit by the rotating blue and red lights. An officer ran a hand over his neck, eyes scanning the dark edges of the property. The night smelled faintly of gasoline from the idling engines, of dust stirred up by footsteps on the dry lawn. Then, in the middle of an otherwise routine sweep, a fragment of sound cut through the static. One of the patrol radios crackled unexpectedly, carrying a brief, indistinct transmission. It wasn't the dispatch channel. The voice was low, muffled, speaking in clipped words that no one could fully make out before the line went silent. A technician later confirmed that the frequency matched one used internally by law enforcement, a channel not accessible to the public. For a moment, the officers on scene exchanged quick, uncertain glances. It could have been interference, they told themselves, a coincidence. Yet the thought lingered that somewhere nearby, someone was listening, speaking, maybe even watching them at that very moment. They didn't yet know that this was not an isolated crime, nor that the patterns were already in motion. What they had was a house stripped of its calm, a victim vanished without a trace, and a radio transmission that shouldn't have existed at all. And that detail, small and unexplained, would one day lead investigators into territory they never expected to cross. In the first days after the attack, investigators moved under the pressure of a community demanding answers. The working theory was simple and dangerously narrow: a lone sexual predator, acting on impulse, who would either strike once and vanish or be caught quickly. It was a conclusion built on probability rather than proof, the kind of shortcut that reassured the public but quietly weakened the investigation from its foundation. The evidence from the scene was gathered hastily. Fibers, hair strands, and biological samples were sealed in paper bags, stacked in a corner of the evidence room. The smell of warm dust clung to them. In those days there was no refrigerated storage, no chain of custody safeguards as strict as modern standards. Weeks later, when some of those bags were opened again, damp spots spread like stains on old parchment. Molds had bloomed in faint green and white clusters, rendering key samples useless. The physical trail, once tangible, had already begun to rot away. Witnesses were questioned, but the process was scattershot. One neighbor insisted she had seen a tall man in a dark jacket walking away from the direction of the victim's home at 9:20 p.m. Another swore the figure was shorter, wearing a light-colored windbreaker. Their contradictions were not uncommon in trauma-driven recollections, yet instead of reconciling the accounts, detectives quietly sidelined one of them as unreliable. The exclusion meant discarding a piece of the puzzle before its edges had even been examined. Then came the second incident. It was only 3 weeks later, in a neighborhood 20 miles away. The circumstances were hauntingly similar. A young woman alone in her home, entry gained through a back door pried open with precision, the same style of ligature binding wrists and ankles. But the report on this second case was filed in a different jurisdiction, under a different case number, and no one thought to compare the two. The system was fragmented, each department guarding its own files, each crime treated as an isolated event in a city map dotted with pins. Inside squad rooms, the conversation remained fixed on local suspects, ex-boyfriends, disgruntled co-workers, neighborhood troublemakers. The idea of a roaming offender, one who could cross districts and counties, was discussed only briefly before being dismissed. That kind of mobility was rare, they said. It required planning, resources, and the kind of detachment not seen in impulsive predators. Still, not everyone accepted the neat division between cases. In the early morning hours after the second crime, a young patrol officer sat at his desk reviewing the crime scene photographs from both attacks. He wasn't part of the investigative unit, but he knew how to look for patterns. The tread mark on the soil from the second scene caught his eye, the same diamond-shaped pattern, worn at the same angle as the print taken from the first scene's back steps. It was a small detail, the kind that could be explained away, but his instinct told him it was more. He printed both photographs, laid them side by side, and stared until the first light of dawn touched the blinds. The prints were too alike to be coincidence. He drafted a short memo recommending the evidence be sent to the FBI for comparison. By mid-morning, the paperwork was on its way up the chain, but somewhere between his desk and the evidence storage, the shoe print photographs vanished. They were not in the folder when the request reached the property room clerk. The log showed they had been checked out by someone in plain clothes, no signature recorded. When the officer asked about it, he was told perhaps they'd been misfiled or sent to another department. Weeks later, the trail was cold. Officially, the two cases remained unlinked. The public was never told about the similarities, and the narrative of isolated incidents persisted. That decision shaped the next phase of the investigation, and not for the better. In the meantime, the suspect, whoever he was, appeared to adapt. The next reported crime occurred in yet another jurisdiction, this time with slight alterations. A different point of entry, a change in the binding material, a shift in the sequence of actions. Whether these changes were intentional to confuse investigators or simply the evolution of his method was unclear. What was clear was that the pace was quickening. The psychological profile that could have been constructed in those early days was never attempted. No behavioral unit was called in, no regional database cross-referenced for similar crimes. The silence between departments allowed the pattern to breathe and grow. To the families of victims, this silence felt like absence, as though the violence had been swallowed by the system and left to fade. By the close of that year, the file on the first attack had thickened with statements, sketches, and a few pieces of physical evidence that were now less useful than the day they were collected. The file on the second attack sat in a separate building, unmarked as related. The link lived only in the memory of one officer, and in the vanished photographs he had once held in his hands. He did not speak of it often after that, but when he did, it was with the quiet certainty of someone who had seen the first thread of a larger tapestry. That thread had been pulled away before it could lead anywhere, leaving only the question of how and why it had been removed. And in that question was the first sign that this investigation was not just up against a clever and mobile offender, but perhaps something, or someone, inside the process itself. By the late 1970s, the pattern had shifted. What began as a cluster of assaults in Sacramento was now rippling outward, moving south into Modesto, then farther still toward the dense suburbs of Southern California. It was not a chaotic spread. The locations, when plotted on a map, followed arteries of travel, highways and rural connectors that allowed quick entry and escape. He seemed to know the layout of each neighborhood before he ever stepped into it. Survivors spoke of his voice. It was calm, almost unnervingly so, even in the moments of violence. Some recalled the flat tone of a man reciting instructions from memory. Others remembered a strange murmuring, as if he were speaking to himself or reading from a list they could not see. The sound left an imprint deeper than any physical wound. It was the voice of someone in control, someone rehearsed. Communities changed in response. Hardware stores reported spikes in sales of deadbolts and reinforced window locks. Contractors were hired to install security bars over bedroom windows. For some, even that wasn't enough. They sold their homes, abandoning streets they had once believed to be safe, convinced that distance was the only defense. Local news stations began linking the incidents, even when the police did not. Headlines spoke of a phantom who struck without warning and vanished without a trace. The name California's Night Phantom took hold, first in whispers, then in print, a label that made the crime sound almost mythical but also made them impossible to forget. The investigations churned with false leads. In one case, a decorated veteran was arrested after a composite sketch seemed to match his face. His name and photograph appeared in newspapers, but within weeks, DNA testing, crude by today's standards, eliminated him. Another time, a homeless man became the focus after being spotted near one of the crime scenes. He was pursued for months until the evidence collapsed. These mistakes eroded public trust and deepened the sense that the attacker was always one step ahead. Behind closed doors, some detectives began to wonder aloud whether they were hunting a single man or more than one. The consistency of the methods argued for one offender, but the ability to change small details, a new point of entry, a different type of knot, created the illusion of variety. It was a tactic that forced investigators to constantly reassess, to waste time relearning patterns that had only slightly shifted. In the early 1980s, the attacks grew more violent. Several incidents escalated to murder, often involving couples. The control he displayed was chilling, subduing both victims, binding them, and maintaining dominance for hours before delivering the final act. Detectives noted the precision of his movements, the absence of impulsive injury or visible rage. This was not a man who lost control. He never seemed to. The fear bled into daily life. Women learned to keep phones near their beds. Men took to sleeping in shifts when their partners were home alone. Neighborhood watch groups formed, patrolling streets in pairs with flashlights that cut narrow tunnels of light through the dark. Yet for all the precautions, he was never caught in the act. By 1986, the trail of violence had become a grim ledger stretching across the state. That spring, a double homicide occurred in a coastal community known more for its quiet beaches than for crime. The scene bore the signature elements: forced entry through a sliding door, bindings prepared in advance, and the eerie absence of anything stolen beyond the victim's sense of security. It should have been just another line in the expanding case files. But after that night, the attacks stopped. Weeks passed, then months, and still no new reports emerged. The silence was unsettling, like the pause between notes in a piece of music you know is not yet finished. Within the file for that double homicide, there was one detail never released to the public. Among the crime scene photographs was a single, blurred image captured by a neighbor's security camera. A man in a baseball cap walking quickly down the street away from the house. His face was obscured, his hands tucked into the pockets of a jacket. The photograph was placed in a plain manila envelope and marked in bold letters, "Do not release." No explanation accompanied the order. It was filed separately from the rest of the evidence, and few in the department even knew it existed. For the families of the victims, the quiet after 1986 felt like the end of something terrible. For those who had studied the pattern, it felt like the eye of a storm. And for the one who had disappeared so completely, it was an opportunity, a space in which to become invisible once more. By the 2010, the case had settled into the archives of California law enforcement, a name spoken only in past tense, by detectives who had either retired or resigned themselves to never knowing. But the files remained, stacked in metal cabinets, their paper edges softened by time. They were artifacts of an era when science had limits and a criminal could outrun technology simply by living long enough. That changed when forensic genealogy emerged. It began quietly in a cubicle lit by the glow of two monitors. A newly assigned investigator, still in her first years on the force, was tasked with reviewing cold cases. The Golden State Killer file was not meant to be solved. It was meant to be maintained, updated when tips arrived, closed again when they failed. Yet as she read through the inventory of evidence, one note stood out: a set of biological samples collected in the late 70s and preserved in a sealed box. The chain of custody showed no record of these samples being compared to any public DNA databases. She requested the box from storage. When the seal broke, a faint chemical odor escaped, the smell of preservation mixed with decades of dust. Inside, carefully labeled envelopes contained swabs and scrapings, small, almost unremarkable objects. Under a microscope, they were simply cells, fragments of a human life. In the digital age, however, they were a genetic blueprint waiting to be matched. Using GEDmatch, a public genealogy database, she uploaded the cleaned and processed DNA profile. The system hummed quietly, its search extending across thousands of family trees. When the results appeared, her breath caught not a direct match, but a series of connections to distant relatives, people who shared enough genetic material to indicate they belonged to the same extended family as the killer. It was not the kind of result that produced an immediate arrest. Instead, it was a map of possibilities, a web stretching back through generations. The next step was slow and methodical. Working with a genealogist, she began constructing family trees from the matches, tracing lines through birth records, marriage licenses, and obituaries. The work required patience, sifting through decades of life events to find the branch that could have intersected with the crime scenes. Weeks turned into months. Hundreds of names were considered and then set aside. The search moved like water narrowing into a channel, eliminating those too young, too old, too far away during the years of the crimes. Eventually, the list shrank to 5 men, each alive, each having lived in California during the years when the attacks occurred. She studied them one by one. They came from different walks of life: a truck driver, a construction foreman, a real estate agent, a retired postal worker, and one that made her pause, a former police patrol officer. The records showed he had served in a small city in Northern California in the late 70s, around the time the first cluster of attacks began. His personnel file was sparse, with unexplained gaps and a termination noted without detail. In the conference room, the investigative team pinned photographs of the 5 men to a corkboard. Below each face were addresses, timelines, and known associates. The map of California on the opposite wall began to fill with red markers. Each marker was placed where a victim had lived, each connected by string to one or more of the suspects. It was then that a pattern emerged. All 5 men had, at some point, lived within a few miles of at least one crime scene. The proximity was too consistent to ignore. The former patrol officer's markers were different. His path seemed to shadow the earliest cases, sometimes within walking distance of the crime scenes. He had lived in 3 different jurisdictions where incidents had occurred, always moving shortly before or after a major attack. The air in the room felt heavier as they discussed the implications. A man with police training would know how to avoid detection, how to control a scene, how to disappear before the first responding unit arrived. He would also know which investigative steps were most likely to fail and how to manipulate them. Outside the building, the city moved on without knowledge of what was unfolding inside. Cars passed on the street below, their drivers unaware that a decades-old phantom might finally be within reach. The investigator returned to her desk, staring at the list of 5 names. 4 of them were possibilities. One of them felt inevitable. She closed the file, aware that the next steps would require precision. Surveillance, covert collection of DNA, and airtight documentation. Any mistake could collapse the case before it began. In the stillness of that moment, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder, the weight of years pressing into the space between each decision. The breakthrough was real, but it was not yet enough. To bring him in, they needed confirmation, proof beyond the invisible threads of genealogy and probability. And in that pursuit, the line between hunter and hunted was about to grow dangerously thin. The surveillance began quietly. A small team rotating shifts in unmarked cars parked along the tree-lined street of a Sacramento suburb. From the outside, the target's home looked unremarkable, a faded yellow facade, a lawn kept just short of overgrown, blinds drawn on every window. The man inside was in his early 70s, moving through his days with the slow precision of someone accustomed to routine. He shopped at the same grocery store each Thursday, mowed his lawn on Sundays, and never seemed to invite visitors. From a distance, he looked like a retiree who had settled into anonymity. Up close, the team noted other details: the way he scanned parking lots before getting into his car, how he kept his head low in public, the absence of any social interaction beyond polite nods. The scent of fresh-cut grass would sometimes drift into the surveillance vehicle, mingling with the smell of fast food wrappers and coffee as they waited for an opening. It came on a warm afternoon in early spring. The man returned from running errands, stepping out of his car with a plastic grocery bag. As he reached for the door handle, One officer moved in after he went inside, gloved hand wrapping over the same metal surface to swab for trace DNA. The handle was warm from the sun, but it was enough skin cells invisible to the eye, preserved in sterile tubes. 2 days later, another opportunity presented itself. The suspect, sitting in his driveway, spat into a crumpled tissue before tossing it into a bin beside the garage. Undercover officers retrieved the bin within minutes, the faint smell of gasoline from a nearby lawnmower still hanging in the air. The tissue was placed into a sealed evidence bag, marked, and driven directly to the lab. The results came back faster than expected. The genetic profile was exact. It aligned perfectly with the DNA collected from more than a dozen homicide scenes and over 40 assaults spanning decades. The statistical probability of it belonging to anyone else was effectively zero. In the sterile quiet of the lab, the printout seemed almost anticlimactic, a simple match report carrying the weight of entire lifetimes. The case briefing that followed was sober, almost restrained. No one cheered. They reviewed photographs, crime scene summaries, and timelines. The pins on the wall map now connected by a single name. The man who had eluded capture for over 40 years had lived openly, shopping, driving, maintaining his yard, all while his history remained hidden in plain sight. In pulling his personnel records, the team uncovered something that had never appeared in any public account. The suspect had once been a uniformed police officer in a small Northern California city during the height of the attacks. He was dismissed after being caught shoplifting a hammer and a can of dog repellent from a hardware store. The incident should have ended his career in law enforcement entirely. Yet the paperwork was buried in administrative files, sanitized of detail, classified under personnel matter to avoid embarrassment to the department. With the official stain removed, he was free to disappear into civilian life. The implications were unsettling. He had been trained in patrol work, familiar with response times, dispatch procedures, and the weaknesses of investigative protocol. He knew how to move without leaving usable evidence, when to strike, and how to vanish before units arrived. Every knot, every entry point, every piece of misdirection had been sharpened by the mindset of someone who once wore a badge. Outside the suspect's home, the surveillance team continued their watch, knowing that the arrest would have to be precise. The operation was set for early morning when his movements would be most predictable and the street least active. The night before, a light rain fell, leaving the air cool and heavy with the smell of wet asphalt. The neighborhood was still, save for the occasional hum of a passing car. At dawn, the unmarked cars rolled in. Officers approached from both ends of the street, their footsteps muffled on the damp pavement. When the front door opened, the suspect's face showed only the briefest flicker of recognition before his expression settled back into the unreadable calm he had carried for decades. The cuffs closed around his wrists with a click, the same sound that had ended countless arrests in his former life. Only now it was meant for him. As he was led to the waiting car, the early light caught the silver in his hair. Neighbors stood behind curtains, watching silently. To them, he was the man who had lived quietly among them, watering his lawn, driving to the store, waving occasionally. To the officers, he was the embodiment of a phantom that had haunted the state for half a lifetime. In the back seat he sat motionless, eyes fixed on the seat in front of him. There was no protest, no question, just the steady breathing of someone who understood that the game was over. But in the minds of those who had pursued him, one question began to take shape. If his history as a police officer had been hidden for so long, what else had been buried alongside it? The courtroom was heavy with a silence that felt more like containment than calm. It was late morning when the defendant was led in, the shuffle of his steps muffled against the carpeted floor. He wore a plain orange jumpsuit, his frame slightly hunched, his gaze fixed downward. For many in the gallery, it was the first time they had seen the man without the shield of a quiet suburban life around him. For survivors and the families of those who had not survived, it was the moment when the face of a nightmare finally stood in the open. He did not contest the charges. His attorneys had reached an agreement, a full admission of guilt in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. It was not mercy that brought this deal, but the weight of evidence so overwhelming that prolonging the trial would only delay the inevitable. Still, the words mattered. Each guilty spoken by his attorney was a nail sealing decades of unanswered questions. The prosecutor began reading the indictment, his voice deliberate and steady. Scene after scene unfolded, a timeline of calculated intrusion and violence. He described how the defendant had studied his targets, sometimes for weeks, noting their routines, the layout of their homes, and the absence of vehicles in driveways. The jury heard about telephone lines cut cleanly before entry, about cords prepared in advance and hidden in pockets, ready to be used at the moment of confrontation. They heard about the deliberate separation of victims, one forced into another room while the other listened, immobilized, knowing what would come next. Each account carried sensory fragments that anchored them in reality. The smell of leather gloves, the scrape of a knife against the edge of a bed frame, the beam of a flashlight narrowed with tape to control the spread of light. These were not the chaotic acts of an opportunist. They were the rituals of a predator who understood that control was more than physical strength. It was the ability to dictate every second of an encounter. Psychologists called to testify described a man who operated on a dual plane. Outwardly, he could present as measured, calm, even courteous. Internally, he harbored a compulsive drive to dominate and humiliate. The violence was not a byproduct of rage but an intended outcome. The fear he induced was, in itself, a form of gratification. He manipulated his environment with the precision of someone who knew both the tools of law enforcement and the vulnerabilities of civilian life. The defense offered little in the way of counter-narrative. There was no plea for misunderstanding, no claim of diminished capacity. What emerged instead was an unspoken acknowledgement that the man in the defendant's chair had lived a double existence. One as a neighbor who waved from his driveway, another as a figure who moved silently through bedrooms in the dead of night. It was during the evidence phase that the most unsettling revelation surfaced. Among the items recovered from his home was a weathered cardboard box found in the attic, pushed into the farthest corner beneath insulation. Inside was a notebook, its cover stained and brittle. The pages were filled in small, meticulous handwriting. Each entry documented a crime, date, location, method, and outcome. There were details that had never been made public, along with notes about the victim's appearances, possessions, and spoken words. One entry in particular stood out to the prosecution. It described an attack that investigators had long attributed to another suspect, a case they had considered unrelated. The handwriting left no ambiguity. He claimed it as his own. This single page reconfigured part of the historical record, adding a crime to his tally and erasing a name once held in suspicion. When the entry was read aloud in court, the air seemed to thicken. Some in the gallery leaned forward, others closed their eyes. For the families connected to that case, it was the collapse of yet another belief about the past, the realization that the wrong person had carried suspicion for years while the true offender walked free. The notebook also revealed patterns invisible in police records. It showed periods of dormancy, weeks or months without activity, followed by sudden bursts of multiple attacks in close succession. The writing suggested these pauses were not the result of fear or deterrence but deliberate intervals, as if he were allowing tension to rebuild before releasing it again. Reading the entries, forensic psychologists spoke of a compulsion that was both organized and ritualistic. This was a man who planned in layers: the physical approach, the psychological domination, and the post-event recording of the act, as though documenting a trophy. The care with which he wrote suggested the crimes lived on for him not only in memory but in the tangible record he created. As the proceedings neared their end, the weight of the testimony pressed into the room. The survivors and families sat in stillness, some gripping photographs, others with hands clasped tight. There was no catharsis in hearing the details, only the sober affirmation of what had been suspected or feared for decades. The defendant rarely looked up, his posture unchanged. When asked if he wished to make a statement, he declined. There was nothing he could offer that would lessen what had already been confirmed. In that refusal was another truth: he had spoken enough through his actions and through the pages found in the attic. The judge's voice, measured and formal, moved toward sentencing. The gallery remained silent, absorbing the finality of the moment. Yet outside the courthouse, reporters waited, cameras ready, the air carrying the hum of live broadcasts. The name that had once belonged to an unidentified phantom was now bound to a face, a history, and a conviction. But inside those attic pages, there were still entries that investigators had not released. Some contained descriptions of places and people that had yet to be matched to any known case file, and those details hinted that the full extent of his crimes might never be fully counted. The day of the final hearing arrived under a flat gray sky, the courthouse steps lined with news crews and onlookers. Inside, the air was tense but hushed, the shuffle of feet and the creak of wooden benches the only sounds before the session began. The defendant sat at the defense table in his orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed, eyes lowered. In the gallery, rows of survivors and relatives of the dead waited for their chance to face him. One by one, they spoke. Some held photographs worn soft at the edges, images of faces frozen in youth. A few voices trembled as they described years lost to fear, to grief, to the unanswered questions that haunted their lives until this moment. Others spoke without wavering, detailing the night their lives were divided into before and after. There were words of anger, of longing, of bitterness. And among them, there were words of forgiveness, not for him to receive, but for the speaker to release. The man at the table rarely looked up. When he did, his gaze was brief, almost indifferent. Psychologists later suggested that by now he had already retreated into himself, a mental withdrawal from a world where control had slipped beyond his reach. For decades, he had dictated the terms of every encounter. Here, he could dictate nothing. Beyond the courtroom, his arrest had rippled into the legal system. California lawmakers introduced measures to extend or eliminate the statute of limitations for certain violent crimes, closing the gap that had allowed so many of his assaults to go untried. Funding was increased for the preservation of biological evidence, and departments were urged to digitize case files to prevent the kind of fragmentation that had once concealed his trail. Law enforcement officials, in rare public admissions, acknowledged the failures, the lost photographs, the unlinked reports, the reluctance to share information across jurisdictions. The image of infallible investigative machinery gave way to something more human and more fallible. These acknowledgments were not enough to undo the past, but they became part of its reckoning. When the sentencing was delivered, it came without dramatic flourish. The judge's voice was steady, the words final: life imprisonment without parole. The man who had once moved unseen through California's neighborhoods would now move only within the walls of a prison. Outside, the air carried the faint scent of rain on concrete. Reporters spoke into microphones, their voices carried over the hum of satellite trucks. In homes across the state, people who had lived under the shadow of his crimes watched the images play out: the courtroom sketches, the still photographs, the clips of him being led away. And then, in one final echo, the footage from his arrest was replayed. The silver-haired man in a t-shirt and sneakers, walking across his front lawn under the grip of two officers. The grass was bright underfoot, the morning light soft against the scene. The camera followed as he was guided to the waiting car, the cuffs visible against his wrists. For decades, he was a ghost. Today, he was just a man in chains.